Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. A prominent NDP MLA from Lethbridge announces that she'll be stepping away from provincial politics. Lethbridge Tory MP Rachel Thomas says the Trudeau government needs to remove the gag order from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, which discusses the most recent report on the federal carbon tax. And a journalist from Al Jazeera was killed after the Israeli military says it rescued hostages from his home.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, she was first elected in 2015 to sit in the Lethbridge West seat, and then since was re-elected in 2019 and again in 2023. But that seat will soon sit vacant, as MLA Shannon Phillips made her official announcement today that she will be leaving the Alberta legislature. BCN's Jeanette Roche has that story.
To an opposition caucus.
She is one of only two new Democrat members outside of Edmonton and Calgary to be elected in 3 consecutive terms to Alberta's Legislative Assembly. And today, Lethbridge West MLA Shannon Phillips officially announced she'll be giving up that seat July 1st.
I am exploring opportunities in the private sector. I'm also looking at ways that I can give back to the community through teaching and writing.
Vaguely citing reasons for her departure, such as family.
Along the way, my children have grown up in politics. They were 4 and 6 when I was elected to government. They are now teenagers with their own loud opinions about politics and my place in it.
And timing.
I think now is the right time in terms of the growth of the party, the strength of the party, but also for me personally. There is no question that sometimes public life has had its ups and downs for me and its share of challenges.
Many speculate those challenges include her very publicized head-to-head legal battle with the Lethbridge Police Service, starting with a 2017 incident at Stella's Diner, where she was secretly photographed by LPS members who were unhappy with her efforts to end off-roading in the Castle Mountain region of the Rockies. She was also the subject of what became known as Meme-gate, where a series of disparaging images were made of her and passed around the department. Then, following a release for public information, it was discovered several members of the LPS had run database searches on her. Recently, the Crown chose not to prosecute the former LPS members who were involved in the searches, despite an ACERT recommendation to do so.
What I can't take is what happened from the LPS, given as it is so far outside the acceptable norms of the rule of law and the institutions of liberal democracy, for which they have never been held accountable and never shown a whiff of responsibility. There is no question that that is part of it.
And according to University of Lethbridge professor Lars Hallström, Phillips's departure isn't overly surprising.
Particularly with Rachel Notley, of course, also going in the same direction. It's been a bit of a rough few years here for Shannon, not politically or electorally, but I think locally with some of the issues regarding the police surveillance. So I can see after more than a dozen years of being in this kind of context, and particularly with some of the changes coming in terms of the NDP leadership, it probably makes sense.
The NDP will choose their new leader on June 22nd. Phillips's departure will leave an empty seat to be filled during a by-election, which will be announced at a later date. For Bridge City News, I'm Jeanette Roche.
Since her time in Alberta politics, Phillips has worn several cabinet minister hats, including Minister of the Environment, Parks and Climate Change. And up until the final sitting of Alberta's 31st legislature, she also served as finance critic. So what does Phillips's resignation mean for the Alberta New Democrats moving forward? Dr. Lars Hallström, political science professor from the University of Lethbridge, has some thoughts on the matter, and he joins us now from the U of L. Dr. Hallström, many would argue that the powerful voice from Shannon Phillips will be missed by a number of her constituents. Does that give the Conservatives more of an opportunity now to win the riding of Lethbridge West?
If you look at the electoral history on this side of the river, so to speak, we do know that from 75 onwards, of course, it did tend to vote very strongly Conservative. There is a Conservative base here, but I think it would be tough for a UCP candidate, especially right now, to step into this to try to fill Shannon's sizable boots. She's left a real, pardon the pun, footprint on politics here and, of course, across the province. And I think there are a lot of people who look to having a voice from somebody like Shannon, who is not only progressive, but really actually very politically astute and knows where she stands on almost every policy issue and is consistent in her advocacy and her voice on behalf of those positions. And I think people are looking for that kind of position and representation to happen here on the West Side.
So who do you think will really pick up the torch and be that loud voice for the party now that Shanna Phillips is stepping aside?
Hate to speculate. It's a very real and germane question. They're big boots to fill. There are not automatic people. Oh, here's so and so in the wings. There isn't an immediate number two. Running for office in general is a real undertaking. It takes a lot of commitment and a lot of resources. A lot of people, understandably, try to avoid taking on that kind of load and burden. And we know that not everybody in Alberta and even here in Lethbridge is necessarily in favor of the NDP. So I don't know who's going to step into that. I'm not privy to the inside discussions, of course, within caucus, so I can't say.
Okay, thanks so much for your time today. That was political science professor Dr. Lars Hallstrom joining us from the University of Lethbridge. Jonathan Bradley is the Alberta Legislature reporter for the Western Standard. He joins us now from Edmonton. Jonathan, the Alberta NDP is losing a very loud and powerful voice with the resignation of Shanna Phillips. How much will her stepping aside maybe hurt the party?
I think it could be a major issue for the party. I mean, if you look at the map of Alberta and which ridings the Alberta NDP holds, outside of Calgary and Edmonton, they don't have too many other seats. And Lethbridge West is one of a few NDP seats outside of those cities. And if the UCP recruits a like stellar candidate and, there's a by-election call, the UCP could take that seat from the NDP. And that could just reduce their voice within rural Alberta.
Now, this leaves a vacant seat in the Lethbridge West riding. Will Naheed Nenshi, who's seeking the party leadership, also potentially seek a seat here?
I mean, I don't know if Naheed Nenshi has much of a connection to Lethbridge, if he's familiar with the area and all that. I do think that if that was the case, it could hurt him because he's widely known as this big city mayor, and people in Lethbridge, it's more of a smaller city, so he might not be able to understand the issues affecting it. I suspect maybe that Rachel Notley might resign as an MLA, and then Naheed Nenshi will parachute into Edmonton Strathcona, as Edmonton Strathcona is one of the safest seats for the NDP in all of Alberta. I think it would be a little bit risky for him to take a shot at Lethbridge West.
Jonathan Bradley, Alberta Legislature reporter for the Western Standard. Thanks so much for your time today. The Alberta New Democrats will be choosing their new leader to replace Rachel Notley later this month. Voting began on June 3rd, and according to party officials, there has been a record turnout so far, with 50% of party members having voted already. The new leader will be announced at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Calgary at 2 p.m. on June the 22nd. Lethbridge Conservative MP Rachel Thomas says the Trudeau government really needs to be more transparent. She's demanding Ottawa to, quote, stop the cover-up and take the gag order off of the parliamentary budget officer to allow Yves Giroux to reveal details of his carbon tax report.
He has been prevented from releasing the report that is in his possession. But that's no surprise to us because, of course, we know that the Liberals appreciate transparency about the same way they appreciate an enema. But the budget watchdog would like to release this report. He just needs the go-ahead from the Liberal government. So would they finally agree to be transparent with Canadians, let the sun shine in, and have the report made public?
Let's do a little history lesson. The PBO once said 8 out of 10 Canadians are better off under this pollution pricing scheme. Flash forward to today. The PBO says 8 out of 10 Canadians are better off under this pollution pricing scheme. You know where they're not better off, though? In that member's constituency, where the Premier increased gas prices by 13 cents a litre, and I don't see her in front of her constituency office protesting.
Federal Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc says the Liberals will support a Bloc Québécois motion to expand the mandate of a public inquiry into foreign interference. They want to make sure it looks into a panel's finding that some MPs knew they participated in meddling. The vote will take place on Tuesday.
We're going to support the motion precisely because we think that the Hague Commission offers us an appropriate forum whereby the allegations that surfaced in the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians can be examined. We understand that all parliamentarians should want to ensure that the appropriate review takes place with respect to parliamentarians themselves. All political parties agreed last summer to set up the Hogg Commission. The Hogg Commission obviously has the appropriate security clearances, has the appropriate security in terms of documentary handling. The Hogg Commission will have access to all of the information, of course, that the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians had, and the Hogg Commission can request any other documentation that they would require.
Now, the federal government, however, has refused requests to name names on the grounds that the intelligence reports can contain unverified information, and it's up to the RCMP to lay charges where appropriate. Federal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland says there will be changes to the capital gains legislation in this year's budget. Freeland says that means a high tax bill for those who make more than $250,000 in profits in a single year from capital income. She says the move will ensure millionaires are not paying a smaller tax rate than middle-class income earners such as teachers and nurses.
Many of the wealthiest Canadians make most of their money through investments, not income. But because of how investment gains are taxed, well-off Canadians can wind up paying a lower marginal tax rate than a nurse or a plumber. That's not fairness. That's favoritism. And so, beginning on June 25th, well-off Canadians will pay tax on 2/3 of their capital gains instead of just 1/2.
Freeland adds that no capital gains tax will be applied when Canadians sell their principal residence. All of the equity will stay with the homeowner. The Conservatives now have to vote in favor of raising taxes or risk being tagged as a party of millionaires if they vote against it. Police are trying to determine the cause of a devastating fire at a historic Toronto church. Community members are mourning the loss of the sacred space that housed unique artwork by members of the Group of Seven. St. Anne's father, Don Byers, says members of his congregation are in shock but determined to rise from the ashes.
I live in Parkdale and I saw the dark smoke out my window. Well, I learned that from last night that it was St. Anne's Church. I've known a lot about the murals that are inside from the Group of Seven, and also there is a plaque, a National Historic plaque outside. So I know a little bit about the history of the church, that it was built in 1907. With the Group of Seven, I think people were just kind of understanding the Group of Seven and what they did, and you know they could see it at any time on the roof and in the church, and it's gone. So that's a huge loss for our community.
So extraordinary artwork was lost. Canadian artwork at its very best. 3 members of the Group of Seven had painted murals in the church, and they were stunning. They covered the whole important scenes from the Old Testament and New Testament. There were images of the prophets that were in there. It's almost hard to describe how beautiful the works were and how rare. It was the only religious artwork, to my knowledge, that the Group of Seven ever did.
Calgary Mayor Jyoti Gondek says her city did a better job of getting information to Calgarians during the devastating flooding in 2013 than it's doing right now as it's dealing with a major water main break. Gondek says she has observed that information is not getting out there or finding out a little too late, but says that will change. The mayor says repairs could take up to a week, and until then, Calgarians must restrict their water use to prevent the city's underground reservoirs from running out. Gondek says people have asked for examples of how they can conserve water, and the city could have done a better job of explaining it to them. 2 people who were riding a motorcycle near Lethbridge, Alberta in the Crow's Nest Pass have died. RCMP say the bike they were riding on collided head-on with a minivan when the bike they were riding on rounded a curve on Highway 3A. Police say the 59-year-old man who was driving the motorbike, along with his 43-year-old passenger, were both from the Lethbridge area. The crash is still under investigation. Lethbridge police have charged a 34-year-old man in connection with the assault of a 51-year-old man who was stabbed in a Southside alley. Police say they received a call on Sunday just before noon about an injured man in front of a business in the 1100 block of Mayor McGrath Drive South. When they arrived, the man was suffering from life-threatening injuries and was taken to Chinook Regional Hospital. He was later transferred by STARS to a hospital in Calgary, where he is now listed in stable condition. 34-year-old Christopher David Smith is charged with aggravated assault and assault with a weapon. He is scheduled to appear in court on Wednesday. Lethbridge Fire and EMS were called to a patio fire on Sunday morning. Emergency officials say they were called to the blaze on the 9th floor of an apartment building at Berkeley Place West at around 5:22 a.m. 21 firefighters from 4 stations responded and quickly got the fire under control. Now, fortunately, there were no injuries, and the cause of the fire is under investigation. The Holy Catholic School Division announced that Dr. Scott Morrison will be taking over the role of interim superintendent. He will slide into the role in August and will maintain that position until October. Officials say Morrison has been an educator for over 30 years now and spent a decade as chief superintendent of Christ the Redeemer Catholic Schools, which serves over 10,000 students. He's from southwestern Alberta, having been born and raised in Taber, and received his Bachelor of Education from the University of Lethbridge. The board intends to have a new superintendent in place by November of this year. A special community garden has been set up at the Interfaith Food Bank here in Lethbridge. Officials say it's a way to teach community members how to plant and grow food for themselves. BCN's Heidi Echevarria has that story.
Growing a garden and producing one's own food can significantly increase food security. That's what is happening at Interfaith Food Bank's community garden, which produces over 900 pounds of vegetables and fruit during the summer month.
Say you live in a smaller house and you don't have a traditional garden bed, it's kind of a space to show you, oh, as long as it holds dirt, you can grow plants in it. Anyone is allowed to come out and be in our space, use our space, so on. It's just getting that conversation started with us to see if we can facilitate what you want to do. It was a wide range of produce, from peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, raspberries, strawberries, corn, squash, eggplant, cucumber, and a wide range of other fruits and vegetables.
This garden not only lends its soil so that members of the community can benefit its people, but also the produce planted by Interfaith Food Bank and its volunteers have a noble destiny.
For sending it out to our clients in their hampers when they come to pick those up, we use it in some of our community programs. Our food recovery team. So the produce here is used for a wide range of things, varying from sending it out to clients, used for various gardening workshops here, used for cooking classes in the co-op community kitchen or in the Chinook family country kitchen.
This community garden also has a special space for the Indigenous community.
We also have an Indigenous healing garden. The purpose of the garden is kind of a reconciliation area with the First Nation peoples and the people who were here before us. So in those spaces we grow primarily traditional plants that have a purpose, and we work with elders and other First Nations peoples as well to tend and care for those plants properly. So some of those plants include wild roses, tobacco, yarrow, sage. We have raspberries and strawberries as well, which are local to the Alberta area and were used by First Nations peoples.
This Friday, June 14, Interfaith Food Bank will celebrate National Garden Day. The fun begins at 12 p.m. in the garden and will feature activity for both adults and children alike. For Bridge City News, I'm Heidi Echevarria.
Well, we had kind of a mixed bag weather-wise today in Lethbridge. We had sunshine, some clouds, even light showers, and more moisture may be on the way tonight. Full weather details are on deck. It has been so nice here in Lethbridge with all the moisture we've been receiving. The extra rain has been filling up our reservoirs and watering our trees and lawns. Beautiful. Everything's nice and green. Tonight, there's a chance of more rain developing with a low near 11 degrees. Tuesday, the clouds should clear out and we should see a balmy high of 28. Lots of sunshine is on tap for the rest of the week as well. Expect a mainly clear sky with a high of 22 degrees for both Wednesday and Thursday. Sunshine and 27 degrees is on tap for Friday. And so far, not a bad weekend is shaping up either. Expect lots of sunshine on Saturday with a high of 25, partly cloudy and a high of 19 degrees on Sunday. Now the average high for this time of year is 22 degrees with an average low of 8. The record high was a balmy 34 degrees set back in 1956, and the record low was a very chilly 0 set back in 1999. The sun rose at 5:24 and will set at 9:38 p.m. Let's see how Tuesday is looking across the country right now. There should be lots of moisture along the west coast. Expect rain and 15 in Vancouver, showers and 17 is on tap for Victoria. Showers at 22 degrees for Edmonton on Tuesday. Rain at 23 for Calgary. Expect a mainly clear sky in both Regina and Saskatoon on Tuesday. Sunshine at 22 in Regina, mainly sunny at 24 for Saskatoon. Expect a mainly overcast day with rain and a high of 21 for Winnipeg. Now, the central part of the country, there should be rain at 26 in Toronto, sunshine at 32 degrees for Ottawa, and in Montreal, partly cloudy and highs well near 32 degrees. In Atlantic Canada, expect rain at 26 for Fredericton, mainly sunny at 23 degrees for Halifax, partly cloudy and 15 for Charlottetown, and at St. John's, it'll be mainly cloudy, rainy, with a high of only 10 degrees. Apple will be partnering with Chat GPT maker OpenAI to get artificial intelligence features into its products. The announcement was made during Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference in California. The widely anticipated display of AI in the iPhone and other Apple products is the marquee moment at an event that traditionally previews the next version of software that powers the company's hardware lineup. Chrysler is recalling more than 17,000 SUVs and pickup trucks here in Canada for a software malfunction. Now, the company says it could disable the vehicle's electronic stability control systems. The recall covers certain 2022 Dodge Durango, Ram 2500, and 3500 pickup trucks. They could have a malfunction in their anti-lock braking control module, which could cause stability control to fail and increase the risk of a crash. Dealers will update the anti-lock braking control module software for free, and Chrysler will notify owners by mail on July the 26th. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 62 points on the day to finish at 22,069. The Dow was up 69 points to 38,868. The S&P 500 was up 13 on the day to 5360, and the Nasdaq was up 59 points to 17,192. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 272 to 77.74 US per barrel. Natural gas was down a cent to 291 US. Gold was up 17.09 on the day to 23.1088 US an ounce, and silver was up 59 cents to 29.75 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.98 per bushel, barley's at $6.29, canola's at $14.20, and corn is at $7.75 per bushel. Live cattle were down $1.30 to $181.60. Feeder cattle August contract was up $3.73 to $258.65, and lean hogs were up $1.98 to $101.68. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 72.69 US. Recapping one of our top stories, a prominent voice for the NDP here in Lethbridge is stepping down. Lethbridge West MLA Shannon Phillips says she'll be leaving her post on July the 1st. She says she has other professional interests she'd like to pursue. Phillips was first elected back in 2015 and since then was re-elected in 2019 and again in 2023. She most recently sat as the official opposition finance critic. A number of Israeli hostages have been rescued by the Israeli military. Hostages who were taken captive and being held at an Al Jazeera journalist's house. Our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari will have details for us momentarily. When you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. Also, be sure to visit our website anytime to check out a number of stories and interviews. Security officials in Israel say 3 of 4 Israeli hostages rescued during a daring military raid by the IDF on Saturday were found in the home of a former Al Jazeera journalist and a Hamas labor minister spokesperson, Abdallah Al-Jamal. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, who joins us once again from the foreign desk in Los Angeles. Lisa, was Al-Jamal, who was killed in the incident, by the way, an actual journalist or simply a terrorist posing as a journalist?
Both. And that's the crazy part, right? How many journalists have been actually identified as working for Hamas, and in this case, quite literally harboring these innocent civilian hostages in their homes. Look, there's so many things to break down here. The world's fixation, the different human rights groups who have been talking about and spreading this idea that Israel is fixated on killing journalists. Well, these journalists happen to be terrorists. Secondly, 4 Israeli hostages were rescued, not freed. According to CNN, they were freed. They were rescued in a very, very complicated mission by Israel's army. And there were there's many people who were killed, Palestinians who were killed in the crossfire. Now, the question then becomes, did the neighbors, friends, families of those who are harboring these Israeli hostages not know that they were doing this? This is terrorism. These aren't innocent people if they were actually involved in the abduction and in the hiding of these hostages. Look, we want to talk about innocent Palestinians. We want to hear their voices. We want to hear them calling out terrorism. We don't want them involved in participating in terrorism. And that's going to be really the tipping point of a future of the Middle East. We saw that in the Abraham Accords, where Arab nations came forward and said, this is not us. We want to be a part of the future. We want prosperity. We want to do away with terrorism. And we're going to stand on this line, this side of the line. We want to see the same thing for the Palestinians. If they're living under Hamas, they need to say no and not do what they're doing. They're actually complicit. We saw that in UNRWA, the UN agency that is given money to help the Palestinians, were actually involved in the October 7th attack. Terrorism. That is pure terrorism. And here, a journalist, and you asked, is he actually a journalist? Well, he was published in Al Jazeera and other publications that people frequently cite and quote and look to as real journalism. And here he is, an actual terrorist posing as a journalist.
And you know what I was taught a long time ago, Lisa, as a journalist myself, it's always good to report on the news, but not to be the news, right? There's a huge line. You never ever cross that. Lisa, a new fire has erupted in northern Israel following more rocket and drone attacks from Hezbollah. Now, at this point, do we know if there are any fatalities or injuries?
There have been a handful, one most recently. Look, in the beginning of the war, we saw these rockets coming in from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. Many were at that point evacuated. Many of those went back to their homes. The question of, when this will begin is on the minds of many. It's not if it will begin, but when this will begin. Obviously, Hezbollah, by the command of Iran's regime, is trickling its attacks into northern Israel and escalating in the past few weeks. We saw fires, thousands and thousands of acres of fires in northern Israel as a result of the Hezbollah firing into Israel and really beginning its escalation and trying to provoke. Now, look, there's so many factors here. It's not just the fact that we know that Hezbollah, again, commanded by Iran's regime, or Hamas in the same situation, want to eradicate Israel. It's a matter of looking up their strategy as to when they want to time this out. We're also looking at an election year here in the United States. President Biden and his administration trying to really wash down this the narrative of the war going on in the Middle East. He wants it off of his docket. He does not want this to be his issue. And of course, both sides are very demanding more of the president to do more for Israel or do more for the Palestinians. And so it's going to be interesting because every single one of these issues are going to factor into if that war with Hezbollah starts sooner rather than later.
Lisa, Benny Gantz, the war cabinet minister and former Israeli Defense Forces chief of staff, announced his resignation from the emergency government. He cited some fundamental differences in strategic approach and a lack of progress towards achieving a decisive, amazing victory over Hamas. Now, what does this mean for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu moving forward?
Yeah, it's not a good look, right? Regardless, it's not a good look. It's bad PR for Israel across the board. It's no secret that there's infighting between the left and right in Israel. We saw it before October 7th. We saw less of it after October 7th, and now we're beginning to see more of it again. Look, that unity that we had after October 7th, that's exactly what Israel needs to defeat Hamas, to focus on its existential threats rather than its internal conflicts. We continue to see some protests on the streets. Again, bad PR. Israel, the country the size of New Jersey, surrounded by enemies, does not need this internal fighting. Now, Benny Gantz had threatened many times, to Bibi and his coalition to say, if this is not going to go X, Y, and Z way, then I'm out. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because, you would hope that they would work together, again, giving this impression of a unified Israel that would stand behind any policy. And I do believe, having studied this area forever, I do believe that when it comes down to it, everybody does agree that Hamas must be eradicated. Everyone agrees on the approach that they took in the aftermath of October 7th, with some small differences. Now, what Benny Gantz is having issue with is what he says is the day after plan. Look, that might be premature, that this might be more of a dramatic move by Benny Gantz in order to secure his political future, to kind of wash his hands from the Bibi Netanyahu era, and to wait until this kind of the fog clears, and then he can come into power once again. We shall see. But again, for the time being, it would behoove Israel and the United States, everyone, to be on the same page and to fight that main enemy, which is that radicalism that is extremely just paralyzing the Middle East. And again, focusing on Iran's regime, focusing on Hezbollah, focusing on Hamas.
The Biden administration, Lisa, has issued a warning in which Lebanon could be flooded with terrorists from pro-Iranian militias coming from Syria, Yemen, and even Iraq. So it wouldn't just be Hezbollah that Israel would really have to contend with.
Absolutely, and that's the plan all along, right? Iran's regime has doubled down in the last decade or more in surrounding Israel with this ring of fire that they call, and they've excelled. They have done what they aim to do, and with that extra money coming in during the Obama years, and now again during the Biden years, they have sold oil up north of $90 billion. They've earned that money on their own because of the loosening of sanctions, because of the money coming in from reparations and other concessions that the United States has made. And that's the danger. We know where Iran's regime spends its money. It's not on the people of Iran, it's on terrorism. It's outside their extracurricular activities in the region. And that's exactly their aim. And again, they were successful in doing it. Houthis in Yemen, insurgencies in Iraq and Syria. You see them propping up the Bashar al-Assad regime. You see Hezbollah in Lebanon for decades now. And of course, Hamas as well. So this is something that the world needs to focus on more than anything else. Here in the United States, we're in an election year, as I said, the border being a major issue. Now, are many of these nefarious actors able to get through the border? Absolutely. We know that many have come up that have been on the FBI's most wanted list, that have been on the FTO, on the foreign terrorist list. So this is something for everyone to keep an eye on, not just Israel. And I think, we have said so many times in foreign policy, it starts in Israel, but that's what we're going to see here in the West very, very soon.
A number of pro-Hamas agitators have surrounded the White House and calling for, quote, dead Jews. Now, Lisa, many of the protesters blocked exits used by the Secret Service, called for the destruction of Israel, so they're not looking for a two-state solution, and even vandalized nearby statues. What I'd like to know, though, is how many arrests were made?
Right. And how, my question is, how does this help the Palestinian people if that's truly their cause, which it's not? Their cause is anti-American. Their cause is pro-terror. People ask me, why would you, are these pro-Palestinian protests, or are they pro-Hamas protests? And it's a difficult question to answer, because on the face of it, they want people to think this is pro-Palestinian. But when you're blocking the highway and not allowing people to get to the airport, or when you're holding up bloody mask of Biden and calling for the death of Jews. Death of Jews. It's not about Israelis. It's not about policy. It's not about land. It's about the death of Jews. That's entirely pro-terror. That is anti-Semitic. It is everything but helping the people that are in the Palestinian territories. And I hope that average Americans or Canadians or Europeans, wherever these protests are taking place, are waking up to the fact that this has really nothing to do with the Middle East, but is just an excuse. They're using that as a springboard to destroy and to really just taint the societies that they're in. Burning American flags, what does that have to do with the Palestinian people? Destroying monuments and historical pieces. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? But I think it's just an excuse, and I think that the police should not shy away from making those arrests and really laying down the law that this is not peaceful protest. This is not freedom of speech. It's none of those things, and I think most people are recognizing that.
The United Nations told Israel that it will add the Jewish state to a list of international states and militias that violate the rights of children during wartime. Now, Israel will now be grouped with what, Hamas and the Islamic Jihad terrorist organizations?
Yeah, it's a joke. This is the UN. It's the same organization that promotes Iran's regime to committees of human rights and women's rights, that promotes the Saudi government to many of those committees as well. So, take it with a grain of salt. This is business as usual over at the United Nations. I don't think this is a huge headline, but it's a shame. It's a shame that the world communities, the body of nations, the United Nations can't stand against terrorism and to recognize the difference between Israel and Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Iran's regime, a country which still has its, one of the biggest gay pride parades in the world, that lets women go to college, that lets Arabs live freely. Muslims, Christians, and Jews live side by side in Israel and are thriving. Those who live inside Israel, I've interviewed many of them, are thriving and are extremely happy with their lives there. And I think it's unfair to really, take this aerial view of the war that's going on and not recognizing how careful Israel is in its approach. Look, in any war, any army, no one's perfect. People will die, civilians will die. It is a war. But when you look at the experts out there that are studying urban warfare, from a very minuscule, down on the ground approach, not their aerial United Nations privileged point of view, you'll see that Israel is being entirely careful. They're warning people. They're trying to get innocent civilians out of harm's way. It's out there. If people want to get this information, it's out there. Again, urban war specialists who are analyzing the actions of the IDF and coming out with reports. So I would take their word for it over Joe Biden's or the UN or Amnesty or anyone else. I think that if people want the information, that's the place to look.
You know what I've been seeing a lot of as well on social media recently, especially when it comes to the pro-Palestinian protests and pro-Hamas protests, are queers for Palestine. I'm thinking to myself, isn't there a bit of a conflict there? Like, do you think that Hamas would really side with those in the LGBTQ+ community? I'm thinking there's not really a good fit there.
Right. Hamas will not side with them or with women or with children, because if they did, they wouldn't hide bombs in schools or in hospitals or in mosques. They wouldn't allow these families, even if they wanted to, volunteer to take these hostages, because then they become part of the war. So they are absolutely using these people as human shields. They're absolutely getting them involved in the war. And really, those casualties are on the hands of Hamas. It's not getting them out of harm's way when they have the opportunity to do so. So again, the information is out there. It's for people to really look in the right places to get the right information, and not the propaganda that is being put out by Hamas or by the UN or by many of these very leftist so-called human rights organizations that are really not promoting human rights in these cases.
Lisa, Alexander De Croo announced his resignation over the weekend as the Prime Minister of Belgium following the resounding defeat of his so-called globalist party. The Open Flemish Liberals and Democrats only garnered 5.9% of the popular vote. So in your opinion, are we seeing maybe a bit of a fundamental change in Europe?
We're seeing a referendum in Europe. What we're seeing is people waking up to leftist policies that sound so great and utopian on paper, but when put into effect are destroying societies, whether it's the lax policies on immigration and the migrants that have come into their societies or anything else. This is a referendum. People are noticing the change in their lives. We saw it in Italy, we saw it in the UK, we saw it in France, and now we're seeing it in Belgium. This is people saying that those are maybe perhaps good policies, but they just don't fit our lives. And it's perhaps buyer's remorse on a lot of these left-wing politicians, and maybe a wake-up call for Europe.
She's our foreign affairs expert and political expert as well. Lisa Daftari, thanks so much for joining us today from Los Angeles.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
If someone brought up the term Tourette syndrome, what kinds of things would come to mind? Most of us probably don't really know a lot about it, but today we are going to learn a bit more about this disorder. And Jerry Firth joins us from Lethbridge. He is the coordinator of the annual Trek for Tourette fundraiser, which just occurred a couple weeks ago in Lethbridge. So he's here in Lethbridge. Welcome to Bridge City News, Jerry. Great to have you on. And I understand that fundraiser took place at Legacy Park, and it was quite successful.
Yes, thank you. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit more about Tourette syndrome.
Of course. Okay, so maybe let's find out, first of all, what your connection is with Tourette's syndrome. Is this something that you yourself have been diagnosed with, or perhaps someone close to you?
Yeah, our oldest child, who's now the age of, well, almost 17 now, was diagnosed with Tourette syndrome at the age of 6. Myself and our youngest child also have tics, which is the most common trait within Tourette syndrome, but it's a part of a host of what would be known as tic disorder. Neither of us have been formally diagnosed, at least not at this point. We also have other individuals in our life that we know that live with and are affected by Tourette syndrome.
Okay, so what kind of a disease is this, and what are the symptoms? You did mention the tics there.
Yeah, so Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder, which means it affects the brain and other nerves within the body. So this disorder involves repetitive and involuntary movements and sounds known as tics. It's part of a group of tic disorders and is the most severe of these types of disorders.
Okay, so can you maybe describe what some of these various types of tics, what these symptoms sort of look like?
Certainly. So tics present differently for everyone. It can range on a scale of severity from minor to rather large and uncontrollable. Movements can be present in any part of the body. That would include the face, neck, arms, legs, and so on. It could include things like flinching, twisting, flinging, among other movements. The vocalizations could include things like humming, grunting, coughing, and vocalizing certain words or phrases. For example, with our child, humming is something that's quite present for them. And they also have various words or phrases that they might repeat. Um, they have an arm flinch that they do when they flick out their arm to the side. But of course, throughout um, the development of Tourette syndrome that they've been living with, their tics have changed and morphed. For myself, for example, I also have most of my tics happen in my face. I also have a bit of a shoulder roll or a shoulder shuffle. You might actually end up seeing that at various times within this interview. Um, and then when I'm often preoccupied with watching TV or something, I will do a ticking noise with my mouth. And so, like I said, it's different for everyone and can look and sound different. And those tics can change throughout the lifetime.
Yeah, you mentioned the change there. Is this something that can gradually increase over time, or does it more decrease? Does it affect younger people more than older people? Do you grow out of it ever?
Yeah, good question. So it typically does change, and the more it's more common with children. People enter that adulthood can live with Tourette syndrome, but often it does decrease, and in many cases, it can actually even go away in time. That's not true for everyone, but I would say that it's more severe among young people.
Okay, all right. Now, we often see Tourette syndrome depicted in the movies as people who maybe like swear uncontrollably. That's kind of what it's known for. But how much reality is there to that?
Certainly, yeah. So movies and other popular media often depict Tourette syndrome on the higher end of severity. The uncontrollable swearing is often known as what's called, see if I get the term right, coprolalia. In reality, only about 10% of people impacted by Tourette syndrome display vocal tics that would consist of things such as the socially inappropriate cussing or swearing. This depiction, unfortunately, can be incredibly harmful and continues to provide the misconceptions of what Tourette syndrome is.
Yeah, no, for sure, definitely. Now, are people with Tourette's are completely aware of the tics that are occurring, or do they try to stop them from happening?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, there is some awareness. I would say specifically amongst the more severe tics, they're pretty hard to be missed by anyone, including the individual. There are times, though, where it becomes a bit of a normal function and you may not acknowledge or recognize them, and others who are familiar with you also may not acknowledge them. And as I had mentioned earlier, that some of them can look like normal actions or behaviors by an individual, so they might go unnoticed by others and themselves. Unfortunately, though, some of the more severe tics can be quite uncomfortable and painful even at times. For example, our child has one where they thump their chest pretty hard, and that can be quite hurtful for them. So those types of tics obviously are ones that they're quite aware of. But like I said, they are uncontrollable and involuntary. So um, there are times that you can work to try to suppress them, but that can be very difficult for most.
How common is this disease, and does it impact one gender more than the other?
Sure. Uh, so tic disorders, so Tourette syndrome is a part of a group of tic disorders, and tic disorders affect about 1 in 100 children, and Tourette syndrome is more around 1 in 160. It tends to affect males more than females. I think it's a 3-in-1 ratio to a 4-in-1 ratio, somewhere around there. Um, uh, and it shows up and presents differently amongst males and females in some ways as well.
Interesting. Like in what way?
Just with regard to well, when it presents itself, males typically end up presenting a little bit earlier in life than females, and um, there are more prevalence with some of the motor tics.
I understand. Okay. What age group does it typically affect? I know you've mentioned you've got young kids even that have it. Does it usually start pretty young?
Yeah, so the first signs of Tourette syndrome usually occur between the ages of about 5 and 10. Now, they can occur as early as the age of 12 or even later, up to the age of 18 is when you might still first start seeing tics occur. They usually start out pretty mild in nature, often with the head, neck, or face, and then later present throughout other parts of the body, and the severity can increase over time as well. But yes, usually in younger ages is when it starts, and and as I mentioned, you can eventually start to grow out of them, and most people do, whereas they might live with it for their life.
Wow. Do you know how many people have been diagnosed with this in southern Alberta or in the Lethbridge area?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's any stats available for this particularly, at least nothing that I could find that was accessible. But if we can imagine 1 in about 160 children being affected, I'm not sure exactly where we are with the population of children, but at 100,000 plus people in Lethbridge, I would say there's probably 300 individuals that are likely affected or living with TS.
Wow, incredible. So what do we know about the cause of Tourette syndrome? Is it genetic, or can the environment around us sort of contribute to it?
Certainly. Yes. So the exact cause itself is unknown. They continue to do research around this area and have not yet found any direct correlation. There are both genetic and environmental effects that then can play a role with Tourette syndrome. We do know that it is pretty common within families, so genetics do play a role, and it can be intergenerational. Now, with it, because there's no real understanding of the cause, there's also currently no cure for Tourette syndrome. However, there are certain treatments that can include things like medication, relaxation techniques, and psychotherapy.
Okay, well, that at least brings some sort of relief, hopefully. Is Tourette syndrome in any way associated with ADHD or OCD?
Yes. So it's actually, well, the term would be that's often used as comorbidity, but certainly Tourette syndrome is often accompanied by any of those other neurological disorders, whether it be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiance disorder, or OCD itself. And so each of those might create new dynamics or have different effects or impacts on how TS might be present, and then also create some other complexities and complications as a result.
Wow. Obviously, it has impact on the individual themselves, but what about what type of impact would it have on the family unit?
Yeah, certainly. So again, I think it would often depend on the individuals who are affected by Tourette syndrome and how the other neurological disorders that they might experience would impact their lives. This could have an effect on behavioral attributes, academics, social behaviors, etc. So it would very much depend on many factors in that way. Um, but I think that a lot of the challenges that come with it is because it's such a misunderstood diagnosis that there's also often a lot of social stigma. Plus, there's also minimal resources available to individuals and families affected. With that social stigma that exists as well, it can also feel like often an isolated experience for the individual and families. Um, and so, uh, again, it would range, but I can speak from our family experience. It's been an incredible journey of many highs and lows, and some often very difficult conversations and some difficult interactions and engagements, both with our child and ourselves, but also with the professionals and other resources that we try to interact and engage with, often trying to explore pathways for the success of our child.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I'm sure it hasn't been an easy road for sure, but hopefully it's brought you together a little bit closer as a family.
In many ways, it has, especially around us taking on a lead in coordinating the Trek for Tourette. It's something that when we first started as a family, shortly after our child was diagnosed, it gave us a sense of community where we weren't the only ones that were living with a child affected by TS, and also help us to better just explore and have conversations about what does it mean to live with TS, and have conversations with others in our lives as well, our family and friends, about what that might look like and mean.
Right. Speaking of which, is there, like, what type of help is there out there for kids who struggle with self-esteem from this stigma surrounding TS?
Yeah, certainly. So there are some professional supports that exist locally. Of course, there's some common things around accessing counseling services. We are fortunate enough to be able to have access to that with our child at a very young age through AHS, Child and Youth Mental Health Supports. There's also a local physician who's a pediatrics um, neurologist. And then we also have access to a psychologist, a psychiatrist. And so a lot of those professional supports have been wonderful. We have looked at and explored other potential supports in Calgary at the Children's Hospital there, where they have specialization in Tourette syndrome. But of course, the travel it creates and poses its own challenges. Uh, but of course, we've been fortunate as a family to be within schools that have been incredibly helpful and supportive. However, again, with the Tourette syndrome being rather misunderstood and just unfamiliar for most people, that the school setting has probably been one of the greatest challenges to try to explore and navigate.
Yeah, I can imagine. With that said, any advice for schoolmates as to how to respond or interact with a fellow student who might have TS?
Certainly, yeah, and I appreciate this question. So, our child, shortly after they were diagnosed, we encouraged them to share about what Tourette syndrome is and what it means to them and how they live with it, so that there can be this familiarity with it. Um, Really, I think if anything, it's important that people understand that the movements and vocalizations are involuntary. Most people who are living with TS struggle with the perception when they might be seen as being interruptive. So I think it's important not just for the classmates, but for the teachers to also know that there's no intention in that area. And there are things that can be done to help in those situations. One, not just the understanding, but also sometimes stress can induce tics. So if a student is struggling in a setting and tics are being set off by their stress levels, to just provide another space for them, perhaps some quiet space for a while. Also, maybe make some accommodations so that they're able to do some learning or some of their exams at a different time or a different location. So it would depend on the individual, but I think it's really just about having understanding and starting some conversations about what are the needs to help be supportive for the individual, but obviously not in a way that's going to create more burden or challenges for the school, but rather create some partnership where everyone can benefit.
Yeah, definitely. Good advice there. And, education is always the best tool. But it looks like we're out of time. But thanks so much, Jerry, for being with us for this very informative discussion on Tourette's syndrome. And all the best to you and your family, of course.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Of course. Jerry Firth is the coordinator of the annual Trek for Tourette fundraiser for the Lethbridge Tourette Group. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks so much for watching.